Before we begin tonight's story, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Is it late where you are? Maybe you're lying in bed or watching this while sketching in your own notebook, much like Leonardo once did. If you'd like to support these long, ad-free journeys into forgotten history, you can now join us on Patreon, where supporters get early access to episodes and help keep this channel alive. You'll find the link down in the description below. Now, let's dim the light, take a slow breath, and travel back to an age where imagination was more dangerous than fire, and one man dared to build machines that the world would not understand for centuries. The year is 1495, and Milan smells of oil lamps, roasted chestnuts and iron dust. You are standing among nobles and soldiers gathered for a grand festival at the court of Ludovico Sforza. Trumpets echo across the hall, silks shimmer in candlelight, and then in front of the crowd, a knight made of shining metal suddenly rises from his chair. He lifts an arm, waves to the audience, and opens his visor, revealing no human face inside, only gears, pulleys, and the ghost of genius. It moves again, mechanical and graceful, and for the first time in history, man witnesses a machine imitating life. The man behind this spectacle is Leonardo da Vinci, the son of an unwed notary from a small Tuscan town, whose curiosity refused to sleep. Wherever he went, he carried with him a small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with mirror writing, diagrams, and thousands of questions about the nature of the world. How does a bird remain in the air? Why does a man sink when he falls into water? Could flight be copied? Could nature itself be reverse-engineered? Centuries before the Wright brothers would test their gliders, Leonardo was already sketching the impossible. One of his earliest designs was called the aerial screw, a towering device that looked like a wooden screw stretching upward into the sky. The sail, made from fine linen, was meant to twist through the air the same way a drill bites into wood. Leonardo imagined four men standing on a central platform, gripping wooden bars and turning them with all their strength, trying to twist the air itself into carrying them aloft. It was, of course, a dream too heavy for the physics of its time. Human arms were never enough to make it fly, but it wasn't failure, it was prophecy. Because 5 centuries later, scientists at the University of Maryland would build a miniature version using modern motors and lightweight materials, and to their astonishment, Leonardo's screw finally lifted from the ground. The spiral rose like a ghost of Renaissance imagination reborn, proving that even an impossible sketch can become truth if the world is patient enough to wait for it. And yet, the aerial screw was only the beginning of Leonardo's obsession with the skies. He drew wings shaped after bats, parachutes woven from linen, and flying machines that looked like monstrous birds. In one of his notes, he wrote that a man with a tent made of linen, 12 braccia wide and 12 deep, may throw himself from any height without injury. He was describing a parachute, centuries before anyone dared to jump. Leonardo would spend hours watching pigeons flutter over the rooftops of Florence, sketching every motion of their wings. Once he even bought a cage full of birds from a street vendor, only to open the door and let them fly away. To him, understanding motion was more precious than owning it. He believed that nature hid its answers in plain sight, waiting only for a patient eye and a curious heart. And so, while others saw only feathers and clouds, Leonardo saw equations, levers, and blueprints of divine design. He didn't just dream of flight, he began to build it. When Leonardo da Vinci looked up at the sky, he didn't see distance, he saw potential. To him, gravity was simply another mystery waiting to be outsmarted, a puzzle written by God that could be solved through observation and patience. And so he began to sketch what might be one of the strangest, bravest ideas of the 15th century, a pyramid-shaped parachute, built not for play but for the survival of dreamers. The design was simple at first glance, a square wooden frame draped in tightly sealed linen, wide enough to catch the air, and slow a man's descent from any height. It looked clumsy, absurd even, compared to the sleek nylon parachutes we know today. Yet Leonardo's notes were precise, confident, and strangely poetic. He wrote, "If a man has a tent made of linen, of which the openings have been stopped up, he will be able to throw himself down from any great height without suffering any injury." The world would not test his idea for 5 centuries. But in 2000, a British skydiver named Adrian Nicholas decided to risk his life on the words of a man long dead. Using the same materials Leonardo would have had, heavy wood, coarse linen, rope and leather, Nicholas built a full-sized version of the parachute, weighing nearly 80 kilograms, almost 10 times heavier than any modern design. And then, with a quiet faith that felt more like madness, he stepped into the wooden frame and rose into the sky. At 10,000 feet, suspended beneath a hot air balloon, the world must have looked like a painting from the mind of Da Vinci himself. Clouds smeared across the sky, mountains in faded blue, and the earth a soft geometry of fields and rivers. Then, with a signal, the balloon crew released the parachute. The linen filled with air, the wooden frame held steady. And against all odds, it worked. The parachute drifted down slowly, carrying Nicholas through the air exactly as Leonardo had imagined. When he finally cut himself loose to land safely with modern equipment, reporters asked him what it felt like to trust a 500-year-old drawing. Nicholas smiled and said, "It took one of the greatest minds who ever lived to design it, and it took 500 years to find a man foolish enough to try it. This deemed was merely..." For Leonardo, flight wasn't simply a mechanical problem, it was spiritual. It was proof that the human body, limited and fragile, could still participate in the divine order of nature. He believed that if we could understand motion, how birds rode the air, how feathers bent, how wind resisted the body, we could learn the very language of God's creation. And for a man who had no formal education, no noble bloodline, and no protector but his own mind, that knowledge became his church. Yet, Leonardo's fascination with motion didn't stop in the air. He wanted to master every element, not only to fly above the world, but to fight upon it, and even to move beneath it. When he travelled to Milan in the 1490s, he offered his services to the Duke, writing a letter that read like the raisme of a madman. He claimed he could design bridges, tunnels, fortresses, and weapons unlike anything ever seen. And tucked casually at the bottom of the letter, as if it were a mere afterthought, he added that he could also paint better than anyone else. The Duke hired him immediately, and soon the notebooks that once dreamed of flight began to fill with weapons. There were sketches of giant crossbows that spanned 24 meters across, monstrous machines designed less to kill than to terrify, of armored tanks, sloped and rounded like turtle shells, armed with cannons that could fire in every direction. But even here, in the machinery of war, Leonardo's mind remained gentle. He hated bloodshed, detested cruelty, and saw war as the ultimate failure of reason. Some historians believe he intentionally drew mistakes into his blueprints, tiny flaws in the gearwork that would prevent these inventions from ever working properly. Perhaps he knew that men would misuse his genius. Perhaps he wanted his machines to remain trapped in dreams. The paradox of Leonardo da Vinci was that he wanted to understand the machinery of death only so that he could preserve life. He was, in every sense, a scientist of mercy, a man who believed that invention, when guided by understanding, could elevate humanity beyond violence, beyond ignorance, beyond even gravity itself. But his next invention would take him far from the sky and deep into the darkness of the sea, a place where no Renaissance man had ever dared to breathe. By the end of the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci had already sketched the skies, the weapons, and the flying men of the future, but the sea still whispered to him, that strange, breathing darkness beneath the surface, the realm that swallowed ships and secrets alike, and in it Leonardo saw another world to be conquered, another puzzle to be solved, another divine mechanism waiting to reveal its laws to the patient observer. When the armies of France invaded Milan in 1499, Leonardo fled the city that had been his home for nearly a decade. and made his way to Venice, a city of canals and salt air, where the ocean itself lapped against the marble walls of the palaces. Venice was under threat by the advancing Turks, and where most men saw danger, Leonardo saw an opportunity to offer his genius as a defense. He appeared before the Council of Venice with an idea so bold that the grey-bearded officials could hardly comprehend what they were hearing. An army beneath the sea, an invisible legion of divers who could strike at enemy ships from below and disappear into the water like ghosts. To make this possible, Leonardo began sketching what would become the first diving suit in recorded history, a strange, almost theatrical creation of stitched leather, sealed at the seams with wax and oil, covering the entire body of the diver from head to foot. From the head protruded a long breathing tube, and above the surface, floating like a buoy, a cork reservoir would serve as a primitive air tank. Leonardo designed it with two valves, one for fresh air to enter, and another to exhale the used air, a system so intuitive that even today's diving regulators echo its principle. In his notes, he described how the diver could descend along the seabed, moving silently beneath the hulls of enemy ships, cutting ropes, sabotaging rudders, and even drilling holes into the wooden planks below the waterline. His sketches included a rotating underwater drill, powered by hand, that could pierce the belly of a galley and leave it taking water without the enemy ever seeing who struck them. To the Venetian generals, this was more sorcery than engineering, and yet every line on Leonardo's parchment had been drawn with the cool precision of a mind that saw no boundary between imagination and mathematics. 500 years later, in 2002, two engineers, Scott Cassell and Jackie Cozen, recreated Leonardo's design for a BBC documentary. They built the suit exactly as described, using tanned leather, cork, and brass fittings. And when their diver entered the water of a controlled lagoon, the impossible happened once again. The suit worked. It kept him dry, it kept him breathing, and he was able to walk slowly along the seafloor, tethered to the surface by the ancient genius of a Florentine dreamer. For Leonardo, the sea was never merely water. It was movement, it was anatomy. It was the same logic that governed the flight of birds and the turning of gears. He often compared the waves of the ocean to the ripples of blood in human veins, believing that to understand one was to understand the other. And perhaps it was this belief that led him toward his most unsettling obsession of all, the desire to uncover the secret machinery of the human body itself. At night, in dimly lit rooms reeking of oil and decay, Leonardo and his apprentices would study human cadavers granted to them by sympathetic friars or curious surgeons. He dissected corpses not with horror but with reverence, peeling away flesh as though lifting the curtain of God's theatre, sketching each tendon, muscle, and bone with terrifying accuracy. He measured the curvature of ribs, the twist of arteries, the folding of the brain, and as he worked, he began to realize that the human form was not chaos. It was the most perfect machine ever conceived. In his notebooks, mechanical gears appeared beside spinal columns, pulleys mirrored tendons, and levers replaced arms and legs. He began to wonder if movement itself, the subtle dance between muscle and bone, could be reproduced through artifice. That question led to one of the strangest and most haunting of his creations, the mechanical knight. Built of wood, leather, and brass, the knight was designed to sit, stand, move its head, and even raise its arms, all powered by a hidden network of gears and cables that mimicked the pull of human sinew. When it was unveiled at a festival in Milan, the audience gasped as the knight rose to its feet and saluted. They laughed when it bowed. They whispered when its visor opened, revealing not a man but the empty cavity of invention. Centuries later, roboticist Mark Rosheim would reconstruct Leonardo's sketches and confirm that the machine could indeed have worked, that it might even have been semi-automated, using counterweights and gravity to move in perfect balance. Incredibly, the same mechanical principles found in Leonardo's knight would later inspire designs used by NASA in the construction of robotic limbs aboard space stations. And so, the man who once dreamed of flight and underwater armies also laid the intellectual foundations for robotics, biomechanics, and human-machine symbiosis. But perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this. Leonardo da Vinci lived in a time without engines, without electricity, without metal strong enough to bear his visions. Yet somehow, through nothing more than parchment and ink, he built the architecture of the future. He may never have seen his machines take to the sky, roll across the battlefield, or march through the dark corridors of the sea, but in every gear, every sketch, and every line of mirrored script, his hand guided the centuries to come. As the years passed, Leonardo da Vinci began to drift away from battlefields and courts, away from the noise of generals and kings towards something quieter, the theatre. For him, the stage was not a place of vanity, but a laboratory of wonder. There, under flickering candlelight, illusion became invention. Wooden dragons breathed smoke, painted skies unfolded by hidden pulleys, and angels appeared to fly through domed ceilings, as if gravity itself had been momentarily convinced to let go. Leonardo's work for the court spectacles of Milan blurred the line between art and engineering, between divine miracle and human design. He devised elaborate mechanical sets that could transform before an audience's eyes, mountains that opened to reveal heavens, planets that rotated in gilded orbits, and creatures that walked and roared on command. It was all theatre, of course, yet behind the wonder was a deeper experiment. Leonardo was teaching himself how to create motion, how to turn stillness into life, how to make a machine behave as if it had a soul. He realized that the same systems of pulleys and gears that animated a stage could, with the right precision, animate the world. He studied anatomy not only to paint but to replicate. He wrote in his notes that movement was governed by harmony, that when one tendon pulls, another must yield, when one lever rises, another must sink. To recreate that balance mechanically was to capture the rhythm of living motion itself. The mechanical knight he built in Milan was no mere curiosity. It was the beginning of a philosophy, that life could be understood as an arrangement of perfect systems, that the divine might be measured not in miracles but in mechanics. Yet even as his machines became more complex, Leonardo seemed to grow more melancholy. He often wrote of time as if it were an enemy. He watched his inventions gather dust, his patrons change, his notes fill with secrets that no one cared to read. His mirrored handwriting, once a code against theft, now looked like a language meant for no one but himself. And within those mirrored lines you can sense a strange awareness, that he knew his world was not ready for the things he imagined. He understood something that the Renaissance could not yet comprehend. That invention is both creation and danger. Every machine that imitates life also steals a little piece of it. Every automaton is both a triumph and a warning. Leonardo's notebooks hold drawings of smiling faces made from gears, of mechanical birds suspended by wires, of lions that could walk across a ballroom and open their chests to scatter lilies at a king's feet. And yet, if you look closely at his sketches, there's something unsettling in them. The same quiet disquiet that hums through modern robotics today. The question of where the line ends between imitation and existence. Perhaps Leonardo foresaw this. Perhaps in the endless night of his mind, he wondered if humanity's desire to imitate itself would one day lead to something it could no longer control. His mechanical knight, his flying machines, his drills and tanks, all pieces of a grander pattern, all steps on a road that stretched 5 centuries into the age of automation, artificial intelligence, and synthetic consciousness. But for Leonardo, it was never about domination or conquest. It was about understanding, the belief that by studying nature so closely that you could reproduce it, you might one day come to know the mind of its creator. To him, science and faith were not rivals but mirrors reflecting the same truth that order existed in chaos, and that curiosity was the truest form of prayer. When Leonardo died in 1519, in the arms of the King of France, his notebooks were scattered across Europe. Many were lost to time, others, centuries later, would inspire the engines of flight, the submarines of war, the humanoid robots of space exploration. Yet none of those who built upon his visions could quite capture the warmth of his imagination, that strange blend of awe and tenderness that turned every gear into a heartbeat. He lived in an age of oil and parchment, but he dreamed in steel and starlight. And though 500 years have passed, the questions he left behind still whisper in every laboratory, every workshop, every sleepless mind that dares to look beyond the possible. Can we build life without destroying its mystery? Can we make motion without stealing the soul that animates it? And when the machine finally stands and waves back at us, as Leonardo's night once did, will we recognize ourselves within it? It is difficult to imagine silence in the world of Leonardo da Vinci, even in his sleep, when he allowed himself to rest. If he ever truly did, one imagines that his mind was still moving, still drawing, still dividing the world into lines and arcs and questions. To Leonardo, everything was a mechanism. A bird's wing was a lever. A waterfall was an experiment in gravity. The human smile was a combination of muscles that could be mapped like architecture. He saw no separation between art and engineering, because to him both were languages for describing the same divine order that governed everything, from the pulse of a vein to the orbit of a planet. In his notebooks he drew more than 13,000 sketches, inventions, devices, strange contraptions that seemed to belong to another century entirely. Some were beautiful fantasies like the mechanical lion that could walk forward on its own and open its chest to reveal a bouquet of lilies, a gift for the King of France. Others were deadly serious, like his scythed chariots designed to slice through enemy infantry with rotating blades, or his plans for multi-barreled cannons that could fire continuously in waves, anticipating the logic of the modern machine gun. He imagined bridges that could be carried by soldiers and assembled in minutes. The first portable bridge, a design so effective that military engineers would revive it 500 years later. And yet, when one turns the pages of his journals, what stands out most is not the ambition of these weapons, but the hesitation behind them. Leonardo detested bloodshed. He wrote that warfare was a madness born of the basest passions, and so his designs were not blueprints of destruction, but meditations on motion and geometry. Every curve, every cog, every pulley in his drawings was drawn not with aggression but with awe, as though he were trying to understand what made violence possible, so that one day it could be undone by knowledge. His mind was endlessly restless. In a single page you might find a diagram for a hydraulic pump, beside a sketch of a human heart, beside a doodle of a cat asleep on a window ledge. Leonardo moved through ideas like a comet through darkness, scattering fragments of brilliance behind him. One of his most remarkable designs was the ornithopter, a flying machine that imitated the wings of birds and bats. It had a wooden frame, a cockpit for the pilot, and massive wings of silk stretched over ribs of cane. Leonardo even calculated the muscles required to operate it, and though the technology of his time could never lift it into the air, his understanding of aerodynamics was centuries ahead of its time. When modern engineers tested his models using lightweight materials and modern power, they found that his equations were sound. The machine could in principle glide. And then there was his fascination with water. Leonardo saw water as the blood of the earth, fluid, powerful, and eternal. He designed water wheels, hydraulic saws, irrigation systems, and even flood prevention mechanisms for entire cities. He studied how eddies formed in rivers, how waves broke against stones, how bubbles rose through water, because he believed that by studying fluid motion, he could unlock the same laws that governed air and blood. His sketches of whirlpools and currents are so accurate that modern physicists still reference them as visual models of turbulence. In one notebook he wrote, "In rivers, the water that you touch is the last of what has passed and the first of what is coming." It was both poetry and physics, a sentence that could only come from a man who saw nature as an endless dialogue between past and future. Among his countless designs was also the self-propelled cart, which some historians consider to be the earliest concept of an automobile. It worked through coiled springs hidden within the frame, released in timed intervals by a series of gears, and when reconstructed by engineers from the Florence Institute of Science, it rolled forward smoothly, exactly as Leonardo had imagined. He had drawn it not as a weapon nor as a toy, but as part of a theatrical device, a stage machine that could move without being pushed, to surprise an audience. Yet unknowingly, he had invented the basis of modern motion. Leonardo's clock mechanisms were equally astonishing. While the world around him still relied on primitive timekeeping, Leonardo designed a dual gear system that could separate minutes from hours, powered by weighted pulleys. His clock was more accurate than any of its era, not because he wanted to measure time more precisely, but because he wanted to understand it. He wrote, "Time stays long enough for those who use it." He imagined submarines, though he refused to share the details of their design, fearing they would be used for war. He sketched mechanical cranes, heating systems, water-lifting devices, and even a primitive contact lens, small glass hemispheres meant to sit upon the eye to correct vision. And while no one around him could build such wonders, Leonardo kept drawing, kept dreaming, as if recording blueprints not for his own time but for ours. And always, behind every invention, there was anatomy. Leonardo dissected over 30 human bodies, drawing every muscle and organ with such accuracy that modern medical students can still recognize their structures today. He measured the chambers of the heart, discovering the spiral motion of blood long before science could prove it. He drew the embryo in the womb, the skeleton of a child, the smile of a woman, and saw them all as parts of the same system, a cosmic machinery built with divine geometry. He believed that understanding the human body was the key to understanding the universe itself. "Man," he wrote, "is the model of the world." In the quiet of his studio, one could imagine him sitting before a table covered in sketches, his lamp burning low, his mind moving faster than his hand. He would pick up one of his notebooks, perhaps the Codex Atlanticus or the Codex Leicester, the same volume that centuries later would be purchased by Bill Gates for $30 million, and on its pages he would try to map the invisible. Some nights he drew weapons, other nights he drew faces, and between the two, in the space where machinery met humanity, he found meaning. His contemporaries called him a painter, but he painted only a handful of works: the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, the Virgin of the Rocks. The rest of his life was invention. And what makes Leonardo so haunting is not that his machines were ahead of their time, but that his ideas still are. He imagined flight before engines, robots before circuits, divers before oxygen tanks, automobiles before gasoline, scientific sketches before the word science even existed in its modern form. In every age there are men who build, but Leonardo da Vinci was something rarer. A man who could see, who saw the invisible architecture of nature and tried to draw it before it vanished. He saw the veins beneath the skin of the world, and through his art he traced them with the steady patience of someone who loved creation itself. In his final years, living under the patronage of King Francis I of France, Leonardo walked slowly through the gardens of Amboise, carrying his notebooks under his arm. He was old, his right hand weak from paralysis, his voice quiet, and yet, even then, his thoughts wandered toward the stars, toward the mechanics of the heavens, the possibility of new worlds. He told the king, "As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a life well used brings happy death." He died in 1519, surrounded by his sketches, his models, and his unanswered questions. They say that when he closed his eyes for the last time, he apologized to God for not having used his gifts more fully, as if the human mind could ever have done more than his had done. Centuries later, when modern engineers build drones, robots, aircraft, submarines, prosthetic limbs, and even artificial intelligences, they are still, in a way, following the same lines he once drew in ink. His machines no longer exist, but his questions do, whispered through laboratories and classrooms and sleepless studios. How far can imagination reach before it touches the divine? And when we finally build something that can think, breathe, and move, Will it be a triumph of mankind or merely the completion of Leonardo's sketchbook? For all his genius, Leonardo da Vinci remains not just the architect of invention, but the poet of curiosity itself, the man who proved that knowledge, when driven by wonder, could make even the air, the sea, and the stars themselves feel reachable. Leonardo da Vinci did not separate the living from the mechanical. To him, they were reflections of one another, bound by rhythm, by mathematics, by grace. When he dissected a human arm, he saw not flesh and sinew but levers and pulleys, perfectly balanced and held together by tension. When he sketched the spine, he noticed how its curves resembled the arches of bridges. When he examined the ribs, he thought of domes. The human body, in his mind, was a divine machine, and nature itself, the grand architect behind it, must be studied the same way an engineer studies his creation. That belief led Leonardo to one of his most overlooked but extraordinary inventions, his mechanical heart. In his dissections, he had discovered that the heart was not a simple pump but a vortex machine, that the blood did not merely pass through it but swirled and turned like water in a whirlpool. This revelation came centuries before medical science would confirm it. Leonardo drew diagrams showing the spiral motion of blood through the valves, and even built glass models filled with water and seeds to visualize how the current twisted as it moved, an experiment so advanced that cardiologists today still cite his drawings as foundational. He did not merely record what he saw, he predicted what could be. In his notes, Leonardo speculated that if one could understand the precise motion of the heart, it might one day be possible to recreate it artificially, to build a machine that could imitate the very beat of life. He had already made limbs move, heads turn, wings flap, and nights stand. To him, the next logical step was to make something breathe. And yet his curiosity did not stop at the body. He turned his gaze to the heavens. His studies of light, vision, and optics were equally astonishing. He built camera obscura devices, dark boxes with pinholes that could project the outside world onto a flat surface, centuries before the invention of photography. He noticed how the human eye, too, was a kind of camera, bending light and forming an image upside down upon the curved surface of the retina. His notes on the reflection of light, the behavior of shadows, and the dispersion of color are so meticulous that Isaac Newton would later build upon them in his optical studies. Leonardo's fascination with light bled into his art. In The Last Supper, the figures seemed to breathe because he painted them not as symbols but as bodies existing in air. He wrote that air itself was a substance, that it gave form to everything, that distance and light shaped emotion. His technique, known as sfumato, was not just artistic but scientific, a blending of tones to mimic the way the eye naturally perceives the soft diffusion of light. That same principle underlies photography, cinematography, even the way our screens simulate shadow today. Everywhere he looked, Leonardo sought unity. He believed that the motion of planets, the growth of trees, and the curve of a human smile all obeyed the same laws. He was obsessed with geometry, seeing in it the code of creation. He filled pages with spirals, pentagons, fractals, and golden ratios, all sketched with the precision of a surveyor and the tenderness of a poet. The famous Vitruvian Man, that naked figure enclosed in a circle and a square, was not merely a drawing. It was a revelation, a statement that the proportions of the human body were the blueprint of the cosmos. He wrote, "The body of man is an analogy to the world as the eye is to the sun, so is the heart to the earth." It was a sentence that could only have been written by someone who saw creation not as chaos but as choreography. Even in his mechanical designs, this reverence persisted. His robotic drummer, built for court performances, could beat a rhythm using a series of cams and levers, the earliest known programmatic machine capable of repeating preset motions. His automated bell systems rang on their own using pulleys and counterweights. His hydraulic organs produced sound powered by water pressure. And perhaps most eerily of all, he designed self-writing machines, early prototypes of what we would now call automation. pens that could trace letters through mechanical guidance, guided by motion instead of thought. Leonardo foresaw a world where machines might one day imitate the creativity of their makers, not to replace humanity but to extend it, to make imagination infinite. When he drew the veins of a leaf and compared them to the tributaries of rivers, he was not being poetic. He was proving that nature repeated its geometry across scales, that the pulse of blood mirrored the flow of water, and that both followed the same invisible architecture. In his Codex Leicester, the very manuscript that would one day rest on Bill Gates' desk, Leonardo wrote long, hypnotic passages about how water shapes the earth, how it carves valleys, deposits silt, and changes the landscape like time itself sculpting memory. His handwriting, reversed, slanted, dense, looked like ripples on a river's surface. He drew eddies, whirlpools, tides, the fall of raindrops, and the spray of fountains. He called water the driving force of all nature. He believed that through understanding water, one could understand the motion of thought. And so, when he designed his hydraulic machines, the Archimedean screws for lifting water, the canal locks for redirecting rivers, the irrigation systems for farmlands, he was not building tools. He was performing philosophy in metal and wood. To him, invention was prayer. He also designed musical instruments because even sound fascinated him. He invented the viola organista, an impossible fusion of a harpsichord and a violin. Instead of plucking strings, a continuous bowing wheel made of horsehair rubbed them as keys were pressed, creating a sound both ethereal and haunting. No one ever built it in his lifetime, but 5 centuries later, when Polish musician Sławomir Zubrzicki reconstructed it from Leonardo's notes, the sound that emerged was astonishingly modern, almost electronic. It was as if the ghost of the Renaissance had learned to sing again. And then there were his dreams for the cities of the future. After witnessing the plagues that swept through Milan, Leonardo imagined a utopian city. He drew entire urban plans with separate levels for pedestrians and waste disposal, wide roads for carriages, fresh water systems running beneath every building, and air circulation designed to prevent disease. What he proposed in the 1490s would not become common urban planning until the 20th century. It is impossible to read his notes without feeling that Leonardo did not belong entirely to his time. He seemed to stand at the edge of 2 worlds, one made of candles and parchment, and another made of engines and electricity waiting to be born. He spoke of things that could not yet exist, but that one day would: flying men, diving soldiers, machines that move without being pushed, instruments that play themselves, drawings that come alive through motion. And though he died centuries before the first engine roared or the first robot blinked to life, his fingerprints are everywhere, on every airplane that rises, every submarine that dives, every drone that hovers, every circuit that moves in imitation of a pulse. Leonardo da Vinci was not a man who simply lived in the 15th century. He was a bridge, one foot in the past, one reaching toward the infinite. He proved that imagination is not a rebellion against reason, but its highest form. Even now, 500 years later, when we open his notebooks and stare at the looping lines of mirror writing, it feels less like reading and more like listening, as if the whisper of the Renaissance still murmurs across the paper, asking us the same question that kept Leonardo awake through the night. If nature is the greatest artist, what does it make of those who try to imitate her? By the time Leonardo da Vinci reached France, the fire of youth had left his hands, but not his mind. His hair had turned the colour of parchment, his beard flowed down like smoke, and yet his eyes, those same eyes that had once watched birds in flight over the rooftops of Florence, still glowed with restless intelligence. He was welcomed by King Francis I, who adored him not as an engineer or a painter, but as something rarer, a living mystery. The king called him mon père, my father, and gave him the small manor of Clos-Lucé, not far from the royal palace at Amboise. There Leonardo spent his last years surrounded by gardens, models, notebooks, and silence. He could walk through those gardens slowly, the air heavy with the scent of roses and river mist, and imagine entire worlds that had not yet been built. On his work table sat sketches of bridges that could fold, cities that could float, and even machines meant to travel beyond the sky, rough circles with spinning vanes, sails designed to catch the wind of heaven. He had once written that the moon was covered in dust, that the earth shone upon it like a mirror, that perhaps it was not a divine lantern after all, but a world like ours. He had no telescope, no data, no modern proof, only the precision of imagination. Even in old age, Leonardo's notebooks kept multiplying, each one a universe. He wrote about the growth of plants, about fossils, about how seashells found high in the mountains must mean that the earth itself had once moved and breathed. He drew the slow rising of continents, the erosion of stone by time, the endless cycles of nature consuming itself and beginning again. To Leonardo, the world was not fixed. It was alive, in motion, evolving. He was, without knowing it, writing the first notes of geology and paleontology centuries before those sciences had names. He was also thinking of the stars. In one passage, he speculated that the Milky Way might be a multitude of tiny distant suns, a thought so close to truth that it feels impossible to have come from a man who had never seen through a telescope. His cosmology was not a rebellion against faith. It was faith itself, expressed through reason. He believed that by studying the mechanics of creation, one came closer to the mind of the Creator. The world, he said, was an infinite work of art, and the artist's duty was not to worship blindly, but to look closely. At Clos-Lucé he built miniature automata for the court, small lions and birds that moved on their own, powered by clockwork, but they were no longer built to impress patrons. They were meditations, quiet experiments in the imitation of life. The servants who cleaned his studio spoke of strange noises at night, gears turning, metal arms flexing, the sound of brushes scraping on parchment long after midnight. Perhaps he couldn't stop. Perhaps even at 70, Leonardo feared what silence might bring. The king would often visit him, not to command but to listen. They would walk along the garden paths, the young monarch in his bright cloak and the old inventor moving slowly beside him. Francis asked about the stars, about God, about the strange mechanical night that once waved to the crowd in Milan. Leonardo would answer softly, his words half in Italian, half in French, his voice like a fading candle. In his last recorded conversation, he told the king that human genius was a spark of divine fire, but that it burned too quickly. As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, he said, so a life well used brings happy death. He died in May of 1519, in that small manor far from the cities that had once celebrated and betrayed him. His friends said that he was holding a small wooden crucifix when he passed. His last words were an apology, that he had offended God and mankind by not doing enough, as if even he, whose mind had glimpsed the future, could not believe he had earned rest. After his death, his notebooks scattered like leaves. Some were kept by his pupil Francesco Melzi, others stolen, others lost to time. For centuries scholars tried to understand them, but the handwriting, reversed, mirrored, labyrinthine, was a puzzle in itself. Only in the modern era, when technology caught up to his imagination, did the world finally begin to comprehend what it had inherited. His designs found new life. The helicopter, the tank, the diving suit, the parachute, the robot, the camera, the anatomical diagram, the city plan, all traced back to his quill. Engineers, surgeons, and astronomers began to realize that their disciplines had already been dreamed of by a man who died before Columbus even reached the Americas. Leonardo da Vinci had built not machines but metaphors. Every invention was a conversation with the future. And now, as our own world fills with drones, androids, artificial hearts, and programs that imitate human thought, it feels as though we are stepping into the very sketches he left unfinished. He imagined the mechanical man. We have built him. He imagined the flying screw. We have given it wings. He imagined motion without touch, thought without words, life without soul. And now, In laboratories and code, we are testing those boundaries again. 5 centuries later, Leonardo's dream and his warning echo together. His machines were never meant to replace humanity, but to remind us that creation carries responsibility, that knowledge without empathy becomes cruelty, and invention without humility becomes its own cage. If Leonardo could see us now, our aircraft slicing through the clouds he once sketched, our robots moving with the precision he once dreamed, perhaps he would smile, or perhaps he would quietly close his notebook and whisper, "You have learned how to fly, but not yet why." And maybe that is the true legacy of his genius, not the machines that followed, but the endless curiosity that keeps us reaching, questioning, building, wondering. Leonardo da Vinci taught us that art and science are not separate languages but verses of the same prayer, the human attempt to understand the divine design. And perhaps, even now, 500 years later, in some silent studio lit only by a single lamp, the world still waits for another mind like his, one that will take up where he left off, and continue drawing the map between wonder and understanding. There is a strange silence that follows Leonardo da Vinci wherever history tries to contain him, a silence made not of absence but of incompletion, the kind that hums softly beneath the turning of gears, beneath the flutter of wings, beneath the electric pulse of a computer in a darkened room. And in that silence, if you listen closely, you can almost hear him, the sound of ink scratching across parchment, of thoughts racing faster than language, of a man who saw 500 years ahead and still felt that he had barely begun. In many ways, the world we live in today is the one Leonardo imagined, though he could never have named it. We move through air the way he dreamed of, carried by machines that twist the wind into lift, and we descend beneath oceans using helmets and valves that follow the exact curvature of his sketches. We walk through cities with running water and ventilation, and light that falls exactly as he studied it, refracted, diffused, reflected. We live surrounded by the mechanics of his faith, because for Leonardo, every invention was a kind of worship, a small attempt to understand what God might have been thinking when he built the universe. When Leonardo wrote in his notebook about the possibility of creating artificial life, he did not use those words, of course, but the spirit was there, the belief that the patterns of existence could be read, decoded, and in some humble way rewritten. His mechanical knight was not simply a toy or an experiment, it was a philosophical question given form. It stood, bowed, moved, and waved, and in doing so it forced those who watched it to ask, if a machine can mimic the gestures of a man, what separates the imitation from the living? And if the difference lies only in the invisible, in consciousness, in breath, in soul, then might those two one day be imitated? 500 years later, in laboratories glowing with artificial light, we find ourselves returning to that same question. Only now the knight no longer waves its arm with ropes and pulleys, but speaks, learns and creates, its gears replaced by circuits, its parchment replaced by code. Leonardo could not have known the words artificial intelligence, yet he would have recognized its shape, because to him, the imitation of life was not blasphemy but curiosity, the ultimate act of admiration toward the Creator. He would have seen in our machines the continuation of his own sketches, the extension of his restless hand reaching further into the mystery. He believed that nature itself was a machine of infinite refinement, and that every discovery was merely the uncovering of another gear in the divine mechanism. His drawings of bird wings and flowing water were not attempts to control them, but to learn their rhythm. In this sense, Leonardo was not just the father of invention, but the prophet of understanding, the man who saw that science and art are not two roads, but one, winding through the same valley toward the same horizon. In our age, where data replaces ink and algorithms dream in our place, we might say that Leonardo foresaw our dilemma, that in learning to imitate life, humanity might forget how to live it. His machines were always meant to serve beauty, not replace it. When he designed a flying screw, it was not to conquer the sky but to understand the sky's patience. When he drew the flow of rivers, It was not to exploit them, but to honor their silence. To him, knowledge without empathy was blindness, and invention without love was noise. In the quiet rooms of Clos-Lucé, he would often write that everything connects: the bones of a man, the branches of a tree, the arcs of lightning, all bound by the same hidden geometry. He called this the proportion of the universe. If he could see our age, with its networks of glass and metal, its satellites circling the Earth like obedient stars, he would recognize that geometry at work. But he would also ask if we had remembered its meaning. If, in drawing closer to understanding creation, we had also grown further from awe. Imagine Leonardo walking through a modern city, past skyscrapers whose girders follow the ratios he once mapped, beneath drones shaped like his sketches of birds, watching humans stare into screens brighter than any flame he ever painted. He would see his own ideas everywhere, multiplied beyond measure, and perhaps, beneath that astonishment, he would feel a flicker of melancholy, because the dream had come true, but the dreamer's gentleness had been lost. He would look at our machines that write, our programs that draw, our robots that heal, and perhaps he would whisper, "I have seen this before," in the eyes of a wooden knight. And yet, Leonardo would not have condemned us. He would have smiled, curious as always, and reached for a notebook. He would have wanted to know how the algorithms worked, how the silicon thought, how the light within the microchip traveled through circuits the way blood once coursed through veins. He would have drawn diagrams, measured voltages, and asked questions that even our scientists could not answer. Because for Leonardo, knowledge was never a conquest. It was a conversation, one that bridged centuries, one that began with wonder and ended with humility. The tragedy of his genius is that the world around him could not follow fast enough. He left his ideas half-born, written backward as if to protect them from ignorance. But the beauty of his genius is that we are still decoding them, still finding, in the loops of his handwriting, instructions for our own future. In the hum of our cities, in the whirring of machines, in the quiet clicking of code compiling, Leonardo's presence lingers. Every invention that moves, that flies, that breathes in imitation of life, carries a whisper of his spirit, the conviction that creation is not finished, that the world is still being built, that humanity itself is a work in progress. And so the mirror that Leonardo polished, that strange mirror of art, science, and divine curiosity, now reflects us. We have become his invention, his experiment, his unanswered question. We are the machines that dream, the sketches that learn to move, the clay that discovered it could shape itself. But even now, as technology fulfills his prophecies, one truth remains unchanged, that wonder is the soul of all invention. Without it, a machine is only metal, a program only code, a life only repetition. Leonardo da Vinci understood that the secret of creation was not to imitate perfection, but to pursue it endlessly, lovingly, knowing it could never be caught. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy he left to us. Not the blueprints, not the mechanisms, not even the paintings, but the restless heartbeat that still whispers through our modern age, urging us to keep asking, to keep imagining, to keep drawing new lines in the margin of the universe. Because maybe, just maybe, Leonardo was never trying to invent machines at all. Maybe he was trying to teach us how to see. If you could stand in Leonardo's final workshop on the morning light touched the walls for the last time, you would see that the room was not silent, but alive with the ghosts of unfinished thoughts, gears scattered like fossilized ideas, sketches half-drawn, notes curling at the edges as though trying to lift themselves from the desk and continue without him. The faint smell of linseed oil and wax still lingers, the same scent that once rose from his paints, and on the work table sits a fragment of machinery, a small wheel, a spring, a wire twisted like a vein. You could almost mistake it for something mechanical, until you realize that what hums in that space is not metal but memory itself. Leonardo's inventions have never truly stopped moving. They have only changed hands. He believed, more deeply than any man of his century, that everything in creation could be read like scripture, that the curve of a feather, the way light filters through a leaf, the sound of a river collapsing against stone, all spoke the same divine language, only written in motion instead of words. And he spent his life trying to translate it. To him, to study was to pray, to build was to worship, and to imagine was to love God through understanding. He wrote that knowledge is the child of experience, but he also knew that experience without imagination is blind, that the heart must sometimes lead where the eye cannot follow. That is why his sketches still breathe. They are not inventions in the mechanical sense. They are meditations, living diagrams of curiosity. The aerial screw that could not fly was not a failure of physics, but an act of devotion, a gesture toward the heavens from a man who wanted to know how angels moved. The tank that could not roll was a study of power, an attempt to see whether control itself could ever be made harmless. The diving suit, the parachute, the ornithopter, all of them questions disguised as devices, each one asking how close the human spirit might come to its own reflection before mistaking it for God. And now, 5 centuries later, we are still asking, when we send a probe to another planet, when we map the brain, when we build a machine that learns to speak, we are repeating his prayer in another dialect. We are still drawing in the margins of creation, still pressing against the boundaries of what can be known, still haunted by the same impossible curiosity that once filled a Florentine notebook with mirror writing. The world has changed, but the hunger has not. If Leonardo had lived to see us now, the cities of glass, the planes that carve through cloud, the prosthetic hearts pulsing in human chests, the programs that compose music or paint images from nothing but data, he might have felt both pride and fear. Pride because his vision had finally found hands capable of realizing it. Fear because those hands might forget why the vision mattered. He would have reminded us that invention without compassion is vanity, that knowledge without humility devours itself, that progress without poetry becomes machinery without meaning. He once wrote that the painter will produce pictures of little merit if he takes the works of others as his standard. He meant that imitation without wonder is empty, and perhaps that is the last warning he ever gave, because Leonardo understood that the true engine of creation is not logic but awe. The moment you stop being astonished by the world, you stop deserving to understand it. So perhaps the question he leaves to us is not what will we build next, but why do we build at all? To fly faster? To see farther? To conquer what remains unexplored? Or to feel again that same tremor of wonder that moved a young apprentice in a workshop 500 years ago, watching light fall through a window and realizing that even dust can glow if you look closely enough? In a way, all of us who imagine, who create, who take apart the world just to see how it fits back together, are continuing Leonardo's experiment. We are his descendants, not by blood, but by curiosity. Every engineer, every painter, every storyteller who stays awake too long chasing a single question is, in that sleepless moment, walking beside him. And maybe that's why his story still matters, because it isn't only about genius. It's about longing. It's about the endless attempt to touch perfection, knowing it will slip through your fingers, and trying anyway. It's about believing that within the dust of this world there is a pattern worth discovering, that imagination is not a luxury but a responsibility. If you are listening to this now, perhaps late at night, perhaps with your own ideas spinning quietly in your head, then you already understand what Leonardo felt. That restless heartbeat of possibility, that ache to turn thought into form, and maybe, just maybe, the inventions of the future are already alive somewhere in your imagination, waiting for the courage to be drawn. So close your eyes and picture him, the old man at his desk, the candlelight trembling over his notebooks, the whisper of gears that will not rest. He dips his quill into the ink, and even as time folds over him, he writes one last line for us to inherit. All knowledge begins in wonder, and the rest, every flight, every machine, every dream, is still unfolding. And so the story folds itself shut, like one of Leonardo's own notebooks, the ink drying slowly in the half-light, the pages breathing faintly, as if even paper remembers the pulse of the hand that touched it. Outside, the air is still, the same air that once carried his thoughts through the narrow streets of Florence and over the canals of Venice, the same air that he believed could lift the weight of human ambition, if only we learned to listen to it. Somewhere far away, the murmur of machinery hums, the faint electric echo of his imagination stretched across centuries, and you realize that the world you inhabit is stitched together with his unanswered questions. If you look around, you can still see him everywhere, in the curvature of an aircraft wing tracing a perfect arc through the sky, in the rhythmic exhalation of a ventilator sustaining breath, in the delicate wiring of a robotic hand mimicking the tremor of touch. Every creation that moves, that sees, that learns, owes something to the man who believed movement itself was sacred. Even the quiet screens that glow beside your bed carry his fingerprint, for the light they cast is the same soft chiaroscuro he once painted on the cheek of the Mona Lisa, that mysterious balance between shadow and revelation, between what can be known and what must be felt. And yet, for all his brilliance, Leonardo da Vinci never sought glory. He never wanted to rule or to conquer, only to understand. He believed that curiosity was the truest form of love, that to study a thing carefully was to honor its maker. He wrote that the eye, which is called the window of the soul, is the chief means whereby the understanding can most fully appreciate the infinite works of nature. That was his creed: to see, to learn, to marvel, to never grow tired of asking. As he grew older, he came to think of life as a single painting, enormous, unfinished, infinite. He would look at his sketches and know that he would never finish them all, but that did not matter. To Leonardo, creation was not an act to be completed. It was a rhythm to be joined, and maybe that is why his presence has never really faded, because some minds do not vanish when they stop thinking. They disperse, like light refracted through time, filling every space where wonder still survives. If you are listening to this now, perhaps in the quiet before sleep, the world dim and the mind adrift, you are part of that rhythm. You are standing in the same eternal workshop, beneath the same dim flame, surrounded by tools and dreams. You are holding, whether you realize it or not, one of Leonardo's invisible notebooks, the one that was never written down, because it lives in all of us who cannot rest until we understand why beauty exists at all. The candle flickers, the gears slow, the ink fades, but the question remains, not on parchment, not in machines, not even in the stars, but somewhere deeper, in that part of the human heart that refuses to stop imagining. And maybe that is the real invention of Leonardo da Vinci. Not the machines, not the blueprints, not the impossible designs, but the permission to keep wondering, to look at the world and see that everything, even sleep itself, is only another mystery waiting to be understood. So rest now, traveler of ideas, historian of dreams, listener in the dark. Let the noise of the world soften. Let the inventions fade to silence. For tonight, even Leonardo's restless mind would forgive you for closing your eyes. Because in the morning the world will still be unfinished, and the dream, his dream, will still be waiting.